If you have ever had even a surface-level conversation about blacks in the United States of America, chances are that you have heard of the brown paper bag test or the paper bag test. Briefly, in case you haven't heard of it, the brown paper bag test is an early 1900s discriminatory practice that blacks used against other blacks, in which an individual's skin tone is compared to the color of a brown paper bag. One was set to pass the test by having a skin tone that matched the hue of the paper bag or was lighter than the paper bag. What did passing the test mean? Access to privileges. Those privileges could be anything from gaining membership to sororities, fraternities, and other social clubs, or gaining admission to schools and even churches. Definitely not an example of black people at our finest hour. But today, I want to discuss the black and partially black people who opened the door that allowed the paper bag test to become a reality. The lighter black Americans who used the brown paper bag test as a tactic to distance themselves from darker black Americans actually had a predecessor group of light-complexioned blacks, biracials, mulattoes, quadroons, and octoroons who prided themselves on their proximity to whiteness and saw dark-complexioned blacks as inferior. The pre-brown paper bag testing group was called the Blue Vein Society. As their name suggests, they delighted in having skin that was so white that their blue veins could be seen through it. And they wanted absolutely nothing to do with other blacks whose veins were concealed by their dark skin. And they went out of their ways to make their disdain for those dark-skinned blacks to be made public. Let's get into it. So, what exactly was the Blue Vein Society? The Blue Vein Society was a loosely organized organization that aimed to identify who was white enough to be considered the upper echelon of blacks. If your skin was so dark that you couldn't see blue veins through it, you were not considered for membership. Their hierarchy held white people at the top, in first place. In a very close second place were the members of the Blue Vein Society themselves, light-skinned black people and people who, because of the one-drop rule at that time, were considered black. People who would have been classified as biracials, mulattoes, quadroons, and octoroons. And then finally, at a very distant third place, were dark-skinned blacks, who the members of the Blue Vein Society felt were inferior in every way. For the sake of context, it is very important to add that the earliest mention that I can find of a Blue Vein Society is in a newspaper article from 1873. That means that less than 10 years after slavery was abolished in the United States, black people, and people who were considered black, immediately started discriminating against dark-skinned black people. The highest priority items were not establishing freedom or equality for themselves, or establishing some way to gain access to money or land or laws that will protect them. No, simply first establishing that we blue veins are better than you darkies was enough. Their top priority was lightness and proximity to whiteness. The irony is that, while Blue Vein Society members were busy distancing themselves from dark-skinned blacks in the hopes to attain adjacency to their pure white counterparts, the white people of that era were shooing them off, wanting nothing to do with dark-skinned or light-skinned blacks, and being equally amused and offended at the notion that light-skinned blacks dare compare themselves to white people. But for the most part, the blacks of that time fully bought into what members of the Blue Vein Society believed. In a nutshell, the lighter, the better. So here the nation was, literally just a few years after the Emancipation Proclamation, White communities were trying to keep black people, both light and dark, away from them, and lighter black people tried to keep darker black people away from them. Light skin was a privilege that they wanted to keep, and they were ruthless and intentional in their efforts to establish their hierarchy, whether it was in their homes, at work, at school, and yes, even at church. The Blue Vein Society was relentless. Here are a few specific examples from newspapers from 1911, 1893, and 1896. I will just read all of the stories and sprinkle in a little commentary. Let's start with the one that seems to be the least harmful, that was published in the Arizona Republican on December 20th, 1893. It was printed in the local briefs that day, and it simply reads, "A Blue Vein Society is being organized by the colored people of Phoenix. Frank Shirley of the Fashion Barber Shop is at the head of the movement, and all the barbers in his employ, except Messrs. Thomas and Polk, will be admitted. All who have white blood are eligible to membership." Nothing much to see here except for that the barbers who were too dark are called out by name in the newspaper. Super tacky. The next story is a bit more harmful and involves Blue Vein Society members denying dark-skinned adults employment as teachers and dark-skinned children access to education. It's from an 1896 edition of the Chicago Tribune, and it reads, "Blue Vein in contempt. Negroes at Washington participate in a race war. Octoroons and other of light color are accused of receiving favors at schools. Factional strife results in a clamor from the full-blooded Ethiopians, who resent the snubs. Their brethren accuse them of dullness." And by dullness, this writer is referring to dim-wittedness or brainlessness. Anyway, back to the article. Washington, D.C., May 1st. A peculiar race war is going on here in Washington, which has broken out with unusual virulence. It is nothing more or less than a fight between two factions of colored people representing the pure blacks and those of lighter skins. The very dark Negroes have begun holding a series of meetings in which they say that those of their race with a large portion of Caucasian blood in their veins are securing all the benefits of the colored schools of the district. The fight has arrived at the stage where the two parties are making serious charges against each other. Men of lighter complexions, like ex-Senator B.K. Bruce, are being charged freely by their black-skinned brethren with misappropriating the funds intended for the use of the colored schools, and also with partiality in the selection of teachers. The pure blacks say that they are not given the slightest show, and that whenever one of their color comes up for examination for the normal school, he invariably is shut out by someone of the favorites whose skin more nearly approaches that of the white people. It so happens that here in Washington that there is a very large contingent of the mixed race. They naturally were the first ones to come north, and the process of amalgamation with the Caucasian is still going on. The light-skinned Negroes say they have secured the greater proportion of teachers and have absorbed control of the schools simply because of the superior energy due to the admixture of white blood. They deny that there has been any favoritism and say that the light-skinned boys and girls learn much more rapidly than those of pure Negro blood, and hence they stand better in the examinations and are accordingly selected as teachers. The fight between the two factions has become exceedingly bitter, and at a meeting of the pure blacks, they denounced their fellows and declared it to be their deliberate judgment that the administration of the schools, which is in the hands of the light-skinned colored people, should be inquired into by a committee of Congress. This war of the pure Negro against the mixed race has been on the point of breaking out openly for a long time, but only now has it come to the surface directly. In Washington, there are many so-called colored people who are recognized as Negroes by their fellows, but who would easily pass, and do pass in a crowd, for white people, as they have at best an eighth or a 16th or even a 32nd of black blood. Now this is my commentary here. At a 32nd of black blood, is it not odd to you that they don't just call these people white? That is literally 3.125% black. Anyway, back to the article. According to the old slavery rule, they are recognized still as Negroes, and they generally attend the colored schools and churches. But nonetheless, they are inclined at times to snub their coal-black brethren, and the result has been the latter are casting about for some way in which to bar out the white Negroes from the schools intended for colored people. First, I just have to say that this writer has a way with words when describing dark-skinned black people and even white black people. But anyway, what I'm picking up here is that the darker teachers who were applying for positions were denied. The Blue Vein Society members claimed that it was because the lighter blacks were simply always smarter and always better qualified than the darker blacks. Do you buy it? And light-skinned boys and girls are simply faster learners than dark-skinned boys and girls. So quite naturally, according to Blue Vein Society logic, because the lighter black children learn faster, they will be the ones to occupy those coveted spots as students in those classrooms. Then, as adults, it only stands to reason that they will also be the only ones qualified to teach. So how could the cycle end? The point was that it wouldn't. And this perfectly illustrates how colorism becomes a system, not just individual incidents of, I don't like him because he's dark. And the final Blue Vein Society incident for this video comes from a 1911 issue of the Shreveport Journal. It reads, Blue Vein Society has peculiar sort of fun at expense of Negro Porter. Using stationery adorned with the crude drawing of a coffin, the Shreveport Blue Vein Society has undertaken to scare the daylights out of Addie Hall, a Negro porter employed for several years at the Meyer drugstore. Hall recently received a letter from the society, which is evidently composed of yaller reading as follows. And obviously that is a phrase that the writer came up with. That is not my own commentary. Back to the letter. The letter reads, Shreveport, Louisiana, February 23rd, 1911. Mr. Addie Hall, Shreveport, Louisiana. Dear Sir, we recognize you as a man, but we remember you are a black man. By foul flattery, you have seduced and married a daughter of the quadroon and octoroon race. We are content with our own kind, but you, a black man, not content with your own dusky women, must come and take advantage of the chance yet allowed you of taking and pulling down one of ours. However, this will not be possible in a few years. Yet, what you have done is done, and now you must pay the penalty. Leave Shreveport at once, or prepare to die soon. Beware. Shreveport Blue Vein Society, members 7 times 7 plus 1 plus 13. That is their letter. Back to the article. The matter was taken up with the sheriff's office, and at the direction of the sheriff, Hall will ask the post office authorities to investigate. In the meantime, Hall is going right along with his work at the drugstore and isn't losing any sleep over the threatened trouble that the yellow coons have up their sleeves in his behalf. However, joke or no joke, the letter went through the Shreveport post office, and the chances are that if Uncle Sam learns the identity of the society members, some of them will be wearing stripes. That is the end of that article. So, death threats. That's it. I don't think that this story requires any further commentary. I did look further to find out if a follow-up story was ever printed revealing the identities of these Blue Vein Society members, but it seems that this particular story was a one and done in Shreveport, Louisiana. Of these 3 news stories, which one was the most shocking to you and why? Let me know in the comments section. These stories are just a few of many stories in which blacks, or people who were considered to be legally black, displayed racist actions towards other blacks for simply being dark-skinned. Again, these Blue Vein Societies started popping up all over the nation just as slavery ended. Chattel slavery, a time when all shades of black people were seen as inferior. As soon as it ended, the first order of business was to make sure that darker blacks know that they were inferior. The notion seems sickening. And before someone leaves the comment, well, we all learned it from our masters during slavery, because when discussions about colorism arise, that comment is invariably in the mix, I have to disclose the uncomfortable fact that colorism existed among blacks before any black people ever had known what a slave master was. Perhaps that is a video that I can make for another time. Calloway was an American jazz singer. He was a band leader, a dancer, and an actor. He is one of the biggest names of the Harlem Renaissance era, and like many of his Harlem Renaissance contemporaries, his name is widely associated with the Cotton Club. But the Cotton Club is only correctly associated with the early days of his entertainment career. Cab Calloway is a man who had a music career that lasted for more than 6 decades. He was an innovator. We're talking about a man who wrote his own Hipster's Dictionary that was released in 1938. A quick study of his dance moves lets you see that without Cab Calloway, there would have been no James Brown, or Michael Jackson, or Prince. Without his hipster influence, there could be no hip-hop. A true original. Cab Calloway was and is legendary. But let's take this back to the Cotton Club, Duke Ellington, and how he and his band were the featured band there in the late 1920s. Well, after Duke's band gained notoriety, they left the Cotton Club so that they could go on tour and Duke could film a movie. So, starting in 1930, Cab Calloway and his band were hired to replace him. In a short amount of time, his band became the Cotton Club House Band. These 2 men have a lot in common. They had similar career paths in the entertainment industry during the Harlem Renaissance era, and both were very famous. They collaborated with a lot of the same people. They even share a very similar phenotype. So I guess that I shouldn't have been too surprised to see a few comments on my Duke Ellington video from people who wanted me to know that Duke Ellington was also Janet Du Bois's father. Let's be clear on that. He wasn't. Janet Du Bois, or Dubois if you prefer the use of French pronunciation, aka Willona from Good Times, her father is Cab Calloway. That is a story that was first uploaded by one of my YouTube mentors, Layla Lynn. In case you haven't seen that video, I'll post a link to it in the description box. Now, back to Cab Calloway and Duke Ellington. All of the similarities that I mentioned that they have, those are correct. But today, the focus is about one of their differences as band leaders at the Cotton Club. The Cotton Club's motto describing their chorus girls was, tall, tan, and terrific. Not only was it their motto, it was their policy. The Cotton Club women dancers were required to be at least 5 feet tall, at most 21 years old, and at their darkest, paper bag brown. They were required to have light skin. The closer to white, the better. You might ask, what does any of that have to do with Duke Ellington or Cab Calloway? The answer is, Duke Ellington never fought or questioned the skin tone policy. Cab Calloway questioned it, fought it, and won. Let's get into it. The Cotton Club opened in 1923. From that year until the year that it closed in 1940, blacks, multiracial, and biracial people in America who wanted to make a name for themselves in show business knew that making it to the stage of the Cotton Club would give them a good chance. Duke Ellington made a name for himself at the Cotton Club. When his name got so big that it was time for him and his orchestra to tour the nation and then the world, Calloway was hired at first on a temporary basis, but ultimately to fill his shoes full-time. Surely this would have been a smooth transition for everyone involved. Prior to being hired on at the Cotton Club, Calloway was a band leader at another swanky nightclub in Harlem, the Savoy Ballroom. The Savoy had a lot of things in common with the Cotton Club, but none of the other clubs' names at that time carried the weight and prestige that the Cotton Club did. Nevertheless, people went to both clubs to drink alcohol, listen to great music, dance, and see shows. Calloway knew how to give an audience great music and a really great show, so this could have been a very smooth transition for him. The owner of the Cotton Club, Oni Madden, just needed to give his high-earning, predominantly white audience a show that was as good as they were getting before. Calloway could certainly do that. Most people who know the genre say that Calloway was a much more entertaining showman than Duke Ellington was. So, smooth transition, right? Speaking of the audience, when they saw Calloway, they weren't seeing anyone who was very different from Duke Ellington physically. So, even with Duke Ellington gone, club business could continue without missing a beat. Smooth transition, right? Well, the transition from Duke to Cab could have gone through without any bumps in the road had it not been for one stipulation that the Cotton Club had for its chorus line dancers. They had to be tall, 5 feet and 6 inches or taller. No problem. They had to be young, 21 years of age or younger. No problem. They had to have light skin, lighter than a paper bag. That was a problem for Calloway. When he was leading his band at the Savoy Ballroom, they were called Calloway and the Missourians. He had his own chorus girls too. They were called his chocolate bunnies, and the chocolate that Cab was serving in his shows looked like milk chocolate, not the white chocolate that was on the menu at the Cotton Club. To give you an idea of what the typical Cotton Club chorus girls looked like, girls who lived up to their tall, tan, and terrific slogan, here are 2 celebrity women who actually got their first big breaks in their show business careers as Cotton Club chorus girls. Lena Horne at the age of 16 and Dorothy Dandridge at the age of 14. So yes, the Cotton Club had a limit on how old the dancers could be, but perhaps no limits on how young they were allowed to be. But that's a topic that we'll discuss for another time when we take a look into other problematic practices employed at the Cotton Club in an upcoming video. But anyway, if you take a look at Lena Horne and Dorothy Dandridge, you have an idea of how a Cotton Club chorus girl was expected to look. So, Calloway and his band had the sound that the Cotton Club wanted, but his dancers didn't have the look required to be hired on at the club. What was Cab to do? He demanded that his chocolate bunnies be allowed to perform on stage with him. When Cab told club management that he wanted his dark-skinned chorus girls to be on the stage with him, he was immediately met with resistance. The Cotton Club's stance was simple. They did not want dark-skinned chorus line dancers gracing their stage. But Calloway wasn't taking no for an answer. Ironically, when Cab showed up to start work at the Cotton Club in 1930, the name of the revue that he and his orchestra brought there was called the Brown Sugar Revue. Cab was determined that the sugar would stay brown, and he had all of the advantages on his side going into this arrangement. Remember, Cab was already employed and doing very well for himself at the Savoy Ballroom. No, its name didn't carry the same weight as the Cotton Club, but the money was good, and Cab had made a name for himself there. And also remember that Duke Ellington was now leaving the Cotton Club. Could the Cotton Club afford to lose Duke after all of his years there, and Cab Calloway before he even started? Maybe Cab Calloway considered these things and more before he gave the Cotton Club an ultimatum. Allow my chocolate bunnies to dance on stage with me, or I am walking. Period. So, the Cotton Club caved, not out of any desire to promote dark-skinned women, but because they needed a band. Following Duke Ellington's departure, they needed a great band. And they got a great band under Cab Calloway's leadership. Many would say an even better and more exciting band. And a group of dark-skinned chorus girls got the opportunity to dance at the world-famous Cotton Club, and everything that came along with it. Greater exposure and the best pay in town for black chorus girls. The women who performed at the world-famous Apollo Theater in Harlem only earned a fraction of what the Cotton Club dancers earned. But the Cotton Club still made clear just what they preferred to see their chorus girls look like. Take a look at this menu that is part of a program from Cab Calloway's tenure at the Cotton Club. I don't know how well this will show up on screen, but on the wine list page there is a section for cocktails. In that section is a cocktail called Tall, Tan, and Terrific, a clear nod to the tan chorus dancers of Duke Ellington's days at the Cotton Club. Anyway, Cab's chocolate bunnies stayed with him at the Cotton Club for his entire residence. When the Cotton Club closed its doors for good in 1940, Cab Calloway moved his orchestra to Club Zanzibar, where they made some of their finest live recordings. Now, before anyone takes things too far, because I can already see the comments coming. If Cab is Wallona's father, and he wanted dark-skinned women on stage with him, Cab loved him some chocolate. Blah, blah, blah. I can only say this. I think that it is commendable that he took a firm stance against the Cotton Club ownership and management to say, you're not going to discriminate against my dark-skinned dancers. They have the talent, let them dance, and pay them. And clearly he had at least one romance with a woman darker than himself in order to have Janet Du Bois as his daughter. But when it came to marriage and creating the children who he publicly claimed for his whole life, he married a woman who looked more like himself. I'm not saying whether any of his actions in that are right or wrong. I'm just giving as much of the full picture that I have, because I know the types of comments that are often in the comment sections of my videos. But let me know, do you see Cab Calloway as a hero for speaking up for his chorus girls with dark complexions? Or was he just doing what he should have done, and other men in his era should have been doing? Let me know in the comments section. Let's get a discussion going. In HBO's The Gilded Age, Season 3, Episode 3, Mrs. Kirkland, played by Felicia Rashad, proudly mentions her nephew being the first black man to graduate from Harvard. What she doesn't reveal, and what the show brilliantly captures through her character's obvious preference for lighter skin, is the tragic irony of what happened to that Harvard graduate's own family. The real man behind Mrs. Kirkland's reference was Richard Theodore Greener, Harvard's first black graduate in 1870. But Mrs. Kirkland's elitist attitudes towards skin color weren't just fictional dramatic license. They reflect the very forces that would tear Richard's own family apart in real life. Richard Greener married Genevieve Ida Fleet in 1874, a woman with a light complexion from Washington, D.C.'s Black elite society. Together they had 5 or 6 children, depending on which source you read. One of those children was a daughter named Belle Marion Greener, who was born in 1879. And I'll tell you more about her a little later. But the point of this story is that Richard's academic achievements and breakthrough at Harvard couldn't protect his family from the colorism that organizations like the Blue Vein Society had institutionalized throughout Black elite circles. In case you don't know what the Blue Vein Society is, to put it briefly, It was a bunch of loosely organized Black groups that started popping up in America right after slavery was abolished. They shared the thought that having a lighter complexion made them better than Black people with darker complexions. The same kind of thinking that Mrs. Kirkland has that I covered in a previous video. When Richard Greener was appointed as a U.S. diplomatic consul to Russia in 1898, he left his wife and children behind in New York. This separation would prove devastating. While Greener was serving his country overseas, his wife Genevieve made a calculated decision that would forever alter their family's trajectory. Genevieve and their children were light enough to pass for white, and she seized the opportunity. But their strategy was more sophisticated than simple racial passing. When Genevieve separated from Richard, she deliberately dropped the final R from their surname, changing it from Greener to Green. Their daughter Belle, when she was an adult, adopted the middle name Da Costa to craft an exotic persona that suggested Portuguese or Spanish heritage, explaining their slightly darker complexion without revealing their true racial identity. Rather than becoming simply white, Belle became an exotic puzzle. Friends believed that she was born abroad, perhaps in Portugal, and most thought she'd been raised in Virginia. This carefully constructed mystery allowed her to navigate white society while maintaining an air of foreign sophistication that made her racial ambiguity seem intriguing rather than suspicious. Belle DaCosta Green, as she now called herself, used this mysterious new identity to achieve remarkable success. She became J.P. Morgan's personal librarian in 1905, managing one of the world's most prestigious private collections. At age 26, she was a confident young woman who brought both brilliance and beauty to the role, and she knew exactly how to use both. Belle was no dowdy librarian stereotype. She wore great plumed hats to auctions and famously declared, "Just because I'm a librarian doesn't mean I have to dress like one." Newspapers described her as a vivacious black-haired beauty who liked to keep her own affairs a mystery. Her flamboyant style and sharp wit made her a sensation in New York's high society. But Belle's success came at a bit of a personal cost. She completely severed all ties with her father, listing Richard Greener as deceased on passport applications throughout the 1910s, even though he was still alive. The Harvard pioneer who had broken barriers for Black advancement was effectively erased from his own daughter, who saw her Black heritage as an obstacle to overcome rather than a legacy to honor. As far as Belle's personal life was concerned, she was clearly someone who the white men of high society had their eyes on, and she seemed to be interested in some of them too. She had romantic relationships, but she vowed that she would never marry anyone. Her most well-known relationship was with a famous art historian named Bernard Berenson. Their relationship lasted for about 10 years, starting around 1908. The only problem with that was that Bernard had been married since 1900. And during the course of this affair with Belle, he remained with his wife, Mary. She just had to suck it up and suffer in silence as Belle and Bernard went on business trips. I wouldn't be surprised if Mary always had her suspicions about Belle DaCosta and her husband, but her suspicions were confirmed when Mary found Belle's letters to her husband. But Belle just wanted romance, not marriage. Bernard remained with his wife until she died in 1944. It seems that a key factor in Belle's commitment to never marrying was that a pregnancy might produce a child who looked more obviously Black and expose her secret. Some research even suggests that she got pregnant by Bernard and during one of their business trips made a quick stop in England to get an abortion. After all, she couldn't have one of these types of situations blowing her carefully crafted cover.
Look at your little girl, look at your little boy. You love them, don't you?
Yes, I do.
But you don't think they're yours.
Just everybody just kept on every time we were out somewhere, my family, they would just say that they're not. There's no way at all.
And what do the customers say?
All of them say, "Are they adopted?" And I say, Supposedly, I'm their father.
Well, that's a shame. But the most scandalous rumors about Belle DaCosta surrounded her relationship with J.P. Morgan himself. Despite their age difference, he was 68 when he hired the 26-year-old Belle. There were persistent whispers that the financier and his young librarian had been lovers. When nosy inquirers asked Belle about it directly, she reportedly replied with her characteristic wit, "We tried." Well, that tantalizing response, which concealed more than it revealed, epitomized Belle's mastery of secrets. Here was a woman who may have been sleeping with one of the most powerful white men in America while hiding her Black identity from him and the entire world. When Morgan died in 1913, Belle continued working for his son, and in 1924 became the first director of the Pierpont Morgan Library when it became a public institution. Her 43-year career was built on maintaining one of the most elaborate deceptions in American history, transforming herself from the daughter of a Black civil rights pioneer into the mysterious mistress of America's cultural elite. Belle burned her 10-volume diary before her death in 1950, ensuring that her inner thoughts about living this double life would never be known. When Richard Greener died in obscurity in Chicago in 1922, Belle didn't attend his funeral. The first Black Harvard graduate's own daughter had become so invested in her fabricated identity that she couldn't even publicly acknowledge the man whose achievements had made her education and opportunities possible. This is the devastating reality behind Mrs. Kirkland's casual mention of her Harvard nephew. The same colorist values she represented in the Gilded Age literally destroyed families, turning children against their own parents in the relentless pursuit of proximity to whiteness and power. And apparently those same kind of attitudes are still destroying families today. I took a look at the comment section in that video, and some of the things that people are still dealing with today with family members regarding colorism are just frankly devastating. Richard Greener's story proves that even the highest achievements couldn't protect some Black families from the poison of colorism that the Blue Vein Society had spread throughout elite Black society. His own daughter's success was built on the complete rejection of everything he had worked to achieve, and possibly on sharing the bed of the very white elite who would have destroyed her father if they had known the truth. Possibly, but we'll never know. Now I'm going to share with you a few news articles from their time to give you a bit of a deeper glimpse into who these people really were. First, let me share this with you. It's an article about Richard after he graduated from Harvard. It's from an 1870 edition of the New National Era. And it simply says, Richard Theodore Greener, the first colored graduate from Harvard, still lingers, we believe, at his home in Boston. High hopes attached to this young man. Surely he ought to find, with little effort, a position where his admitted talents and acquirements can be made serviceable both to himself and his race. End quote. And I gotta say that almost every time he was written about from the 1870s until the 1890s, something about his race was a part of the story. And that would explain why his wife had no choice but to change her last name if she and her children were going to assume identities as white people. And speaking of his wife, let me share this story with you. It's about her, Genevieve, and Richard. This is 2 years after he graduated from Harvard, and might have been one of the first times these two have been at a social gathering. It's from an 1872 edition of the National New Era, written by a correspondent who's on a tour of the East, specifically Newport, New York City, and Boston. And it reads, quote, Socially, I had a fine time in Boston. During my 10 days sojourn, besides evening entertainments, I attended 2 picnics, at all of which I met the Washington belle, Miss Genevieve Fleet, who, if possible, shone with more than her ordinary brilliancy. At the more general gatherings, there were many handsome ladies, but female beauty is more scarce in Boston than in most of the southern cities. A few lines down, he writes of Richard, quote, Mr. Richard T. Greener of Philadelphia, Besides many other places, we visited together Harvard University, of which he is a distinguished graduate, the public library, and the Athenaeum. Always the most genial and instructive companion, on these occasions he was almost indispensable, for the pleasure and profit of those visits would have been lost without him. Then in 1874, just 2 years later, the couple made news when the Washington Chronicle printed that they got their marriage license. And this is my favorite find of this whole little story that I put together today. And I hope that you like seeing it. It's a story about their daughter, Belle, or as she called herself, Belle DaCosta, when she went on to pass as a European. It's from a 1913 edition of the Staunton Courier. And what I like about it most is that it had a photo, or at least one of those like really realistic drawings of Belle in her youth. The beginning of it read, "No equal in America. J.P. Morgan's tribute. Miss Belle DaCosta Green has great financiers' full confidence in all matters pertaining to art, especially in matters of rare books. Is Miss Belle DaCosta Green the cleverest woman in the country?" End quote. Now, I won't read it all, but J.P. Morgan's answer to that question was a resounding yes. The article goes on to mention two of her biggest purchases for J.P. Morgan, saying that she has spent as much as $42,000 for a single book, buying in the interests of Mr. Morgan, who has implicit faith in her judgment. And it went on to say that she recently bought 11 books for a total of $80,000. At auctions, she will bid for hours with a coolness that astonishes the most experienced veterans. And those purchases were such a big deal that multiple stories were written about them. And then there is the ending of Richard. It's a story from 1922. And by this time in his life, only one of his daughters was in touch with him. And even she kept her distance. She would correspond by letters only. Richard was living alone, without a family, but with servants. And he was in decent health. Near 8 o'clock a.m. on May 2nd, he went to take his morning bath and had some sort of attack and died 30 minutes later. Now, this story I'm showing you is from the May 13th edition of the Chicago Defender, almost 2 weeks after he died. His death was published in earlier papers, but just in short 2 to 3 line blurbs. Not exactly the homecoming celebration that you might expect for a man who had lived his prime in the spotlight, being so well known for being a credit to his race, but also an all-around brilliant guy, regardless of his race.
In HBO's The Gilded Age, Season 3, Episode 3, Mrs. Kirkland proudly mentions her nephew being the first Black man to graduate from Harvard, when she's bragging about her family's pedigree to the Scotts, a family she deems as beneath her because Arthur was born into slavery, and frankly the entire family has skin that is just too dark for her preference. Well, the Scotts are fictional, but the first Black man to graduate from Harvard wasn't. The real man behind that reference was Richard Theodore Greener, and the tragic trajectory of his family reveals how colorism and the pursuit of whiteness can corrupt generations. Now, I have discussed Greener's daughter in a previous video, Belle DaCosta, his daughter who chose to pass as European and became a very successful librarian, the librarian for J.P. Morgan, who may or may not have had an affair with him, but she did have an affair with a very famous and very married art historian. There's always talk of whether Black or partially Black people who choose to pass as white or hide their Black heritage did so as a means of survival, and I'm 100% sure that many of them did for that reason, and I don't think that it's fair to judge those 1890s people by today's standards. But were there also some who passed as white simply because they were racist and or colorist? Yes. And that brings us to today's story about another one of Harvard's first Black graduates' offspring. And he is a neo-Nazi who is alive today in 2025. He is Charles Bousman,
the great-grandson of Richard Theodore Greener. While Richard Greener's first family with his wife, Genevieve, passed for white and disappeared into white society, he also had a second family that would produce an even more shocking legacy. During his diplomatic service in Russia from 1898 to 1905, Richard took a Japanese common-law wife named Mishi Kawashimi. Together, they had 3 children, including a daughter they called Michio, whom they nicknamed Olive. Unlike with his first family, Richard maintained a relationship with his Russian-born children. He corresponded regularly with Olive until his death in 1922, and these children carried on his name, unlike the family with his wife, who chose to change their last name from Greener to Green and erase his memory. His daughter Olive eventually settled in America and had her own family, but the seeds of racial confusion, hatred, and identity crisis that had plagued the Greener family line would manifest in devastating ways decades later through Olive's bloodline, particularly her grandson. Olive's grandson was Charles Bowsman, born in 1964 in Greenwich, Connecticut. Charles enjoyed every privilege that American society could offer, attending Phillips Exeter Academy, Wesleyan University, and Columbia University. His father, Jack Bowsman, was a Harvard graduate and an accomplished journalist who served as the Moscow bureau chief for the Associated Press during the Cold War. And Charles, rather than simply rejecting any Black heritage or letting it fade off into obscurity, would go on to embrace the most extreme forms of white supremacy. In 2014, Charles, the great-grandson of Harvard's first Black graduate, founded Russia Insider, a pro-Putin website that would devolve into a platform for anti-Semitic propaganda and neo-Nazi content. By 2018, when he moved to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Charles was openly promoting Holocaust denial and white nationalist ideology. He published a 6,000-word anti-Semitic manifesto called "It's Time to Drop the Jew Taboo," which even RT, which was formerly Russia Today, denounced as hate speech. And just for context, RT is Russia's state-controlled news network that regularly hosted Charles Bowsman as a commentator for years. Many Western countries consider RT as a dangerous propaganda outlet. So for RT to say that Charles was being too extreme, that was really saying something. Charles's descent into extremism accelerated as he began collaborating with prominent neo-Nazi figures. He attended the 2016 National Policy Institute conference organized by Richard Spencer, where attendees threw Nazi salutes. He hosted neo-Nazi rallies on his Pennsylvania property, including the 2020 launch event for the National Justice Party, a pro-Hitler political organization. The bitter irony is staggering. Richard T. Greener, who had been known for fighting racial discrimination and advancing civil rights, now has a great-grandson who promotes the very ideologies that would have seen Greener himself exterminated. Charles Bowsman has praised Adolf Hitler, promoted Holocaust denial, and advocated for the creation of a white ethno-state. His great-grandfather would have had no place in his life or in this world if it were up to Charles. After participating in the January 6, 2021 United States Capitol insurrection, Charles fled to Russia as a political refugee, abandoning nearly $1 million in property. He now appears regularly on Russian state media, promoting both Putin's regime and white supremacist ideology to American audiences. The transformation is complete. The great-grandson of America's first Black Harvard graduate has become a neo-Nazi propagandist working for a foreign power to undermine American democracy. Charles Bowsman's extremism represents the ultimate victory of the colorist ideology that the Blue Vein Society promoted, the belief that proximity to whiteness was more valuable than racial solidarity or even justice. And in case you're not familiar with the Blue Vein Society, it's a topic that I've covered more extensively in other videos, but for the sake of getting on with this video, It was groups of Black people and partially Black people who placed themselves on pedestals above Black people with dark skin. They called themselves blue veins as a nod to the fact that their skin was light enough to see through their veins. These groups started appearing just as slavery was abolished in the United States. Where Richard Greener saw his Harvard education as a platform to lift up his race, his great-grandson, Charles Bowsman, uses his elite education to tear down the very foundations of a diverse, democratic society that made his ancestors' achievements possible. It's a generational betrayal that might have broken Richard Greener's heart. And I say might have because we can't truly know what was in Richard Greener's heart. Some might ask, if his own Blackness was so important to him, why didn't he marry a woman who looked Black the first time? Or why didn't he prioritize making his second family with a Black woman? And those were fair questions. Maybe some would say that Richard should have been able to see all of this coming, everything that happened with his descendants. What we have here is the ultimate legacy of the colorism that Mrs. Kirkland promotes on our fictional show, The Gilded Age, but that had and still has real-life repercussions when families become so invested in whiteness that they lose their souls entirely, producing descendants who actively work to destroy the very communities their ancestors fought to protect. Now, Charles Bowsman is certainly not the only person in history to have disgraced a family name. John Jacob Astor VI was the pouty, sad, jealous son of the richest man who died on the Titanic, John Jacob Astor IV, who also proved himself to be one of the bravest men on the Titanic the night that the ship went down. And for years, the son, number 6, bore the title, The Rich Boy Nobody Wants. I published a video about him that you can see here. I'll also leave a link to it in the description box. Richard died just a few years after Madam C.J. Walker. Her lack of education and her dark skin tone wouldn't allow her to run in some of the same circles as a family like the Greener family, but her income would. Madam Walker was the first Black millionaire, according to the Guinness Book of World Records. Her daughter couldn't pass for white, and she didn't try, but she did burn through a lot of her mother's fortune after Madam C.J. Walker passed away. I made a video about her story, and you can see it here. I will also leave links to it in the description box and the pinned comment. Thank you for letting me be a part of your day. Subscribe for more stories like these.
Shortform.com, New National Era Archives, Arizona Republican Archives, Chicago Tribune Archives, and the Shreveport Journal Archives. Quite Continental, cabcalloway.cc, PBS, Harlem Holiday, The Cotton Club, 1925 to 1940, a dissertation for a doctoral degree in philosophy by Malcolm Womack. American Dancing, From the Cakewalk to the Moonwalk by Megan Pugh, Casey Studio, and The Baltimore Sun.